The wind rolled across the wide Montana plains like a restless spirit searching for a home, brushing against the weathered fence posts and the tall grass that whispered like old prayers. And Sister Maren felt that same wind trembling inside her chest as she rode the final mile toward the Ashford Ranch, clutching the strap of her worn satchel as though the weight inside could anchor her soul. She had lived 3 years within stone walls and chapel bells, yet every hoof step that carried her farther from the convent awakened pieces of a life. She had tried to bury memories of laughter, of running barefoot as a girl, of pain, loss, and choices she had never made peace with. And when the small, dusty ranch finally appeared on the horizon, its barn glowing faintly gold under the afternoon sun, she swallowed hard, whispering a silent prayer that God had not abandoned her on this strange detour of fate. For she had never expected the letter from Mother Thalia to send her here, to a ranch in the middle of nowhere, to check on a man she had never met, but apparently knew her name. The horse slowed as she neared the gate, and that was when she saw him, Grant Ashford, a tall, broad-shouldered rancher whose rugged face carried the quiet strength of someone who had weathered storms far harsher than nature itself. And he watched her approach with eyes that were startlingly gentle for a man who looked as though he could split a log with his bare hands. And the moment she dismounted, he tipped his hat politely, saying in a calm, steady voice, "Long ride from the mission, sister. Welcome to Ashford Ranch." And though his tone was respectful, something in his gaze made her heart quicken, not out of impropriety, but because he looked at her as though he sensed the invisible weight she carried, the kind of weight men like him usually never noticed. She tried to appear composed, smoothing the front of her habit, but her voice faltered when she answered, explaining she had been sent because his injured mare, the one Mother Thalia said was important to him, needed attention from someone gentle of heart. And he nodded, guiding her toward the barn, his steps slow, deliberate, as though he knew she was nervous and wanted to offer comfort without saying too much. And when they stepped inside the barn, the warm scent of hay and horses washed over her, strangely familiar despite the years she had spent away from anything resembling home. And she felt something inside her loosen, something old and aching. But before she could gather herself, the rancher paused beside a stack of hay and gestured for her to sit, saying softly, "Just sit, sister. Trust me." And though she hesitated, unsure why he wanted her to sit, there was something steady and grounding in his voice, the kind of calm that came from men who carried burdens silently. And so she obeyed, lowering herself onto the haystack, gripping her satchel tightly as Grant stepped away to fetch something from the far end of the barn, leaving her alone with her thoughts she had spent years suppressing, the memories of the fire that had taken her family, the guilt that had driven her into the convent, and the quiet fear that she would never feel whole again. And as she sat there listening to the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls, she whispered, "Lord, guide me." Yet even as she prayed, she knew part of her was terrified of what she might discover at this ranch. Terrified of why Mother Thalia insisted she come, terrified of the strange pull in her chest as though destiny itself had reached out and caught her by the collar of her habit. And she nearly jumped when Grant returned carrying a wooden box filled with bandages, salves and a few tools, his expression serious yet kind. And he placed the box gently beside her as if not to startle her further, then knelt to check the mare in the nearest stall, his strong hands moving with surprising tenderness. And Maren found herself watching him in silence, observing how such a large, weathered man handled broken things with more care than many priests she had met. And for a moment she forgot her own trembling until he spoke over his shoulder, his voice low, steady as a creek under moonlight. "I asked you to sit because you looked like you were about to faint, sister. Folks who carry heavy stories sometimes forget to breathe." And those words struck her harder than he could have known, for though she kept her face composed, her heart hammered inside her chest, wondering how could he see through her so easily? How could a stranger recognize the weight she had never spoken aloud? and she cleared her throat, insisting she was fine, though her voice shook slightly, betraying her nerves, and Grant simply nodded, not pressing further, as though he understood that some truths needed time to surface. He guided the mare's head gently, speaking to her in soft murmurs that seemed almost like a prayer, and Maren was struck by the quiet holiness of the moment, for she had met many men who spoke of God loudly but showed no mercy, and here was a rancher who did the opposite, offering gentleness in silence. And she rose from the haystack slowly, feeling steadier now, asking how the mare came to be injured, and Grant hesitated before answering, explaining that a group of outlaws had spooked the herd 2 nights ago, that he had spent the entire night chasing off the intruders and guiding the animals back to safety, and that the mare, the one he called Faith, had been caught in the chaos. Maren approached the stall cautiously, extending her hand toward the injured animal, and Faith lowered her head with surprising trust, allowing Maren to stroke her muzzle. And in that touch, something inside the nun cracked open, a warmth she hadn't felt in years rising quietly, and Grant watched her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something between gratitude and awe, as though her presence had brought a rare peace into the barn. But then, without warning, pain stabbed through Maren's memories, images of another horse years ago. A fire screams, the smell of smoke, and her breath hitched sharply, her hand trembling against Faith's muzzle. And Grant stepped forward instinctively, not touching her but offering his presence like a shield, murmuring, "Easy now. You're safe here." And the gentleness in his tone nearly undid her, for she had not heard words spoken like that. Not since the night her world burned. Not since she lost the last remnants of her childhood. Not since she walked barefoot and ash-covered into the convent, believing God was her only refuge. She blinked hard, swallowing her trembling, stepping back before Grant could read too deeply into her reaction. And she forced a steady breath, insisting, "I'm fine. It was just a memory." But Grant, who seemed to be the kind of man who carried scars of his own, didn't look convinced, and for a long moment they stood in silence. The kind of silence that reveals truth without words, until he finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Someone hurt you, didn't they?" A question so precise she felt her knees weaken, and she clutched her satchel tightly, shaking her head, whispering, "No." "Life hurt me," and Grant nodded slowly, as though that answer made perfect sense, and he returned to tending the mare without pressing further, giving her the dignity of her secrets while offering the safety of his quiet understanding. Maren steadied herself again and asked how she could help, and Grant guided her to hold Faith's reins while he wrapped the injured leg, their hands brushing briefly. Not intentionally, but in that moment Maren felt a surge of heat rise in her face, not from attraction but from the unexpected comfort of human contact, something she had avoided for years, and she forced herself to focus on the mare, speaking soothingly as Grant worked expertly. And by the time they finished, Faith was calmer, her breathing steadier, and Grant leaned back with a sigh of relief, thanking Maren with a sincerity that felt almost strange coming from a stranger. But she only lowered her gaze modestly, murmuring that she was simply doing what God asked of her. Yet deep inside she questioned that, because nothing about this place, this ranch, or this man felt like a simple mission assignment. It felt like being led towards something she had been running from for far too long, a truth she wasn't ready to face. And when the mare was finally settled, Grant closed the stall gate gently and turned toward Maren with a quiet seriousness as though he had been holding back a dozen unspoken thoughts. Yet instead of sharing them, he simply gestured toward the open barn door, where the fading sunlight painted the world in strokes of orange and gold, saying softly, "You should see the view from the ridge before night falls. Folks say it eases the mind." And though she hesitated, unsure if she should be wandering the ranch, instead of returning to her small guest room, something in his tone made her follow him. And they walked side by side up a narrow path behind the barn, the evening breeze cool against her face, carrying the scents of pine and distant rain. And for several minutes neither of them spoke, which made Maren even more aware of the unusual calm settling into her chest. A calm she hadn't felt since before the fire that had taken her family. A calm she had thought she'd never feel again. When they reached the ridge, the land unfolded before them like a painting from God's own hands, stretching all the way to the horizon, rolling fields, wildflowers dancing in the wind, the sky shifting from amber to rose, and Maren exhaled, her heart softening in a way that almost frightened her. For beauty had always been painful ever since the day she'd lost everything she loved. Grant stood a few feet away, giving her space, and said quietly, "I come up here whenever I feel like the world's trying to crush me. Seems like you carry that same weight." And though she wanted to deny it, her body betrayed her, shoulders tightening, breath catching, and she whispered, "I joined the convent because I needed to escape myself." A confession she had never spoken aloud, not even to the sisters who took her in. And Grant didn't turn to her, didn't pry, only listened with an openness that surprised her. And after a long moment he answered, "I know what that's like, running from something that never stops following." And the sound of truth in his voice startled Maren, prompting her to study him more closely. She asked quietly, "What are you running from?" A bold question she hadn't intended to speak. But Grant didn't flinch, only exhaled deeply, his jaw tightening as though reliving something painful, and he murmured, "Not running anymore. But I lost someone too," and the grief in his voice made Maren's chest ache unexpectedly, for grief recognized grief. And she stepped closer without thinking, compelled by a compassion that rose instinctively, the same compassion that once defined her before loss reshaped her into something hollow. She asked who he had lost, but Grant shook his head gently, not refusing her, simply choosing silence. And she understood immediately, for some wounds were sacred, not to be touched by strangers, even though something in her heart longed to bridge the distance between their sorrows. The wind shifted, carrying the chill of the coming night, and Maren wrapped her arms around herself as the sky darkened, and without speaking, Grant removed his coat and draped it lightly over her shoulders, his touch barely grazing her, respectful and distant, yet warm enough to send a shiver through her spine, not from impropriety, but from the unfamiliar comfort of being cared for. And she whispered, "Thank you," with a voice smaller than she expected, as though gratitude itself frightened her more than danger. They stayed there until the last streaks of sunlight disappeared and the stars began to pierce through the darkening sky. And Maren found herself whispering, "Mother Thalia didn't tell me why she sent me here." And Grant finally looked at her then, his expression unreadable under the pale light, saying slowly, "She sent you because you're the only one she trusts, and because she knows you're stronger than you think." And those words hit her like a strike of truth, for she had spent years believing she was weak, broken, hiding behind vows she had rushed into out of fear rather than calling. And she felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, refusing to let a stranger see her cry. Grant glanced toward the barn, hesitating, then said, "There's something I need to show you tomorrow, something she told me only you would understand." And Maren felt her pulse quicken, not from fear but from the unsettling certainty that her visit to the ranch had nothing to do with tending an injured mare, and everything to do with a truth waiting for her in the shadows of her past. They walked back in near silence, the only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the low hum of crickets rising with the darkness. And when they reached the barn again, Grant paused, studying her with quiet intensity, as though trying to determine if she was ready for whatever awaited her. Then he softly repeated the words he'd said earlier, "Just sit, sister. Trust me." And though she didn't fully understand why, those words didn't frighten her. They steadied her, rooted her, as though she had finally arrived at the beginning of something long overdue. She retired to her small room in the ranch house, lying awake long after the moon rose, staring at the wooden ceiling while questions churned inside her. Why had Mother Thalia insisted she come here? What secret did Grant and the Mother Superior share? What truth awaited her in the morning? And somewhere between fear and exhaustion, she found herself praying again. Not the rote prayers she recited in the chapel, but a raw whisper from a heart still learning to trust life again. Lord, if this is your path for me, give me courage to walk it. And as she finally drifted into restless sleep, she felt an odd certainty settle inside her. A certainty she could not explain. Tomorrow would change everything. Your one subscribe means the world to me. It tells me that someone out there believes in my stories, my words, and the feelings I try to bring to life. Every time you support me, it gives me the strength to create new tales, deeper emotions, and more powerful moments. You're not just a viewer, you're the reason these stories exist. Thank you for standing with me, for believing in my journey, and for giving me the courage to keep writing more beautiful stories for you.